Having established that information on a higher cognitive level can indeed work backwards to influence lower levels before we even hear the sentence being that we're going to be processing. In other words, that the first pass of a sentence can indeed be influenced by other kinds of cues. The chapter then moves on page 295 to describe what kinds of cues can influence that first pass of understanding a sentence. The first thing that's described, really the first and the second, it's difficult to dissociate what these two things, how these two things are different, but it describes thematic relations of verbs and then the syntactic frames of verbs. I'll just talk about these two things together because it's too difficult to dissociate how they're different. But the thematic relations and the syntactic frames of verbs tell us things like how a verb can be used, whether one person or two people have to be doing the verb, whether a third person is part of, like whether a third person is an observer or is a recipient of some verb, whether the verbs can be done to somebody or whether they're just done in general, whether the verbs require an object, and whether that object can be an animate object or an inanimate object. All these kinds of things are inherent in a verb. Some verbs can be used in many different ways, and some verbs are more restricted. An example of a verb that's very liberal in the way that it can be used is given on the bottom of page 296. You see that the word walked can be used in many different ways. Raj walked his dog to the park. In other words, one actor can do that verb to an object. Or, second sentence, the dog walked. So, in that situation, the subject of the sentence can do that verb autonomously without any help. Or, the dog walked to the park. So, it can, an autonomous individual or object, the subject of the sentence, can do that verb to somewhere, right? It can do it in a direction or directionally, right? But when we move to, on page 297, some examples are given of the word buried, and this verb is much more restrictive. If they tried to make the same kinds of sentences that they did with walked, using the word buried, they can't. The soldier buried the landmine. That suggests that a subject of the sentence can do this verb to an object. But then the next two sentences, the pirate buried and the pirate buried in the sand, are they're analogous to the sentences that were given for the verb walked, but they can't be used. They're not valid uses of the word buried. So we understand from these cues that are inherent in the verbs themselves about how the verbs can be used, about who's allowed to do these kinds of verbs, that this information about verbs can serve as cues to help us in processing a sentence even on the first pass, the first time through the sentence.